Israel and its ally, the US, has to decide how to respond. But from Turkey to Tehran to Saudi Arabia and even to Egypt, and of course Israel, everyone has to decide what happens next. It is to some extent still not in our certainly not in our control, but it's not. I mean, what happens next is not clear, and it depends on what we do next.
We'll come back to some of those other players as we move along. Javier, in addition to the geopolitical fallout, there's a lot of hanging now over what the impact is going to be on the oil markets and the energy market more broadly in the Middle East and beyond. You wrote a column over the weekend saying, exhale, people. This isn't 1973. This is not, we're not going to witness what we did in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. Play that thought out a little bit for me, please.
Well, it was quite an awakening that morning because we're back, those of us who are watching the oil market, to a surprise attack on Israel, getting the Israeli military completely by surprise, and the parallels, and an oil market that it was already the price was already quite high. So the parallels with 50 years ago were quite multiple, but the market is very different. Here is Hamas, which is a faction of Palestine, waging war on Israel. Is not the whole of the Arab world marching their military towards Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. That's a big difference, and there has not been any indication of any Arab country deciding to side with Hamas in any way. We saw indeed some of the Arab countries, for example, the United Arab Emirates, putting a very strong statement demanding the atrocities. So that is a big difference. There is not going to be a use of oil as a weapon against the West, and then therefore we're not going to see the oil price going from, say, $87 a barrel now to $200 or $300 a barrel. However, as every time that there is war and conflict in the Middle East, we have to consider the potential for the war to spread. And certainly one scenario that we can see is if Iran play a role, if Israel was to retaliate on Iran, then Iran can retaliate. And Iran has made very clear that can disrupt oil supplies, and it has done it in the past. So that will certainly make the crisis a big economic factor worldwide. And the other one that perhaps we can see is that the Biden administration has been allowing Iran to export more oil over the last year, in effect trying to get that prisoner swap that happened recently, but also trying to convince Iran of signing some sort of informal detent in the nuclear arena, with slowing down the amount that is enriching. We have seen a big increase in Iranian supply. Is going to come under question in the next few months, and certainly into 2024.
And certainly, Iran was at least gesturing diplomatically towards more openness to the West, a willingness to talk around, if not détente, an opening to discussions about a more peaceful coexistence. Was that all just kabuki as we look at this now? Were they simply trying to keep people at bay? The Wall Street Journal had a very powerful piece of reporting over the weekend that Iran was deeply involved in the planning of the Hamas attacks, maybe for as long as 2 months, I think, according to the story. And that's of course over the same period when Iran was trotting itself out as a more open member of a diplomatic table. So how do you balance those two things, Javi, when you see that play out?
The short answer is we don't know how much Tehran was into the process, into the military attack. What we know for sure is that Tehran provides financial and political backing to Hamas, and that Hamas will not be what is today without that money and the weapon supply that it comes from Iran. But whether Iran play an active role in preparing the attack, in executing, in training, in perhaps even launching it as indicating to Hamas this is the military course to take. we don't know. You are right, Tim, that Iran has been sending the opposite message. Decided to engage with the Saudis, and Saudi Arabia and Iran recently restarted diplomatic relationships. They interchanged ambassadors. The embassies reopened, and Iran also slowed down a bit, an indication slowed down the amount of uranium that it was enriching. So all the indications from Iran was that they wanted to have a better relationship, and obviously, from an economic point of view, it was making a lot of sense for Iran. They got access to $6 billion, that money that it was held in accounts in South Korea. Now they have been transferred to Qatar, and they can use that money to buy food and medicines. And they were selling quite a lot more oil. I mean, Iran is this year the second largest source of incremental oil supply into the market, and Iran is making, you compare to what Iran was making about a year ago to what it's making today, the difference is about $1.5 billion a month extra selling their oil. So it's very significant. It was benefiting from that. So why Iran will take the risk? But perhaps it's going back to what Andreas said at the beginning. It was feeling left out on a big Middle East diplomacy, and it just wanted to stop it.
Human nature is always unpredictable. Andreas, Javi just mentioned that $6 billion pool of money that is in the process of going to Iran as part of a hostage exchange. There was a fair bit of propaganda put out on social media over the weekend, insisting on Fox and other airwaves that $6 billion was used to fund Hamas's attacks on Israel. The State Department, Fox's own reporters, and others have come out and said there's absolutely no truth to that. That the money is still actually, I think most of it, if not all of it, is still frozen in Doha, and but it does show the extent to which every minute in a crisis like this is going to be politicized, propagandized, and I'm wondering what you make of where the Biden administration is right now in terms of its balancing act between diplomacy and a strong show of military force. How do they roll forward from here?
It's in a tight spot because of the domestic polarization and the clown show in Congress right now that we also write about. And it's international and the diplomatic things required of it. Are you still there, Tim?
I'm still here. Yeah.
You're still there because you disappeared. But let me. So, for instance, in terms of show of force, they have. I think this makes sense. Sent an aircraft carrier flotilla to the Eastern Mediterranean around the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford. I'm not sure right now. Nobody is what exactly they're supposed to do, because you obviously we're leaving the actions in the Gaza Strip to the Israelis unless they're planning some sort of evacuation of hostages. But of course, that is bringing it closer and reminding everybody that the U.S. is a power in the region if things go further. Meanwhile, at home, and while they're working the phones, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State to Saudi Arabia, and all the players I mentioned. Meanwhile, at home, you mentioned those $6 billion. This is an interesting one because it actually genuinely could go either way, and it shows you that if there were once periods in American history, intermittent periods when politics stopped at the water's edge, this is not one of them. And this is another risk, is that we start behaving badly or doing rash or suboptimal things because of domestic pressures. The way that you
what would those be, Andreas? When you talk about rash or suboptimal things, what are you referring to?
Well, I was going to you summarized, and you and Javier summarized the $6 billion correctly. It was South Korean money that is now in a Qatar bank, has been frozen, will be unfrozen, and Iran can use it to buy food and medical stuff. However, as the Republicans in this clown show are pointing out, money is fungible. That is, if Iran knows money is coming, like dollars or $1 bill is the same as another dollar. If it knows 6 billion are coming, it can say, well, we no longer need these 6 billion over there. They could go to Hamas. So this has legs, is what I'm saying. Now, what if a Biden allows himself in this almost election season now to be driven by self-proclaimed hawks or something, we could err on the side of concluding too fast that Iran was behind it and going too hard at Iran and actually having a wider conflagration. On the other hand, if they were behind it, we have to do something, obviously. In this context, it usually doesn't help if domestically one party or even individuals in one party in the House of Republicans use every opportunity like this to just, the way they're doing with linking it to other conflicts, because there's the invasion across the southern border of the US and all of that, which has nothing to do with that, to essentially make hay out of every news peg. And there'll be some awful things happening in the coming days and weeks, because we will see hostages executed. Probably we will see civilians, as we are seeing Palestinian and Israeli civilians hit. And in this context, if you pick a side and always say the Biden is doing everything wrong, then that bars him from certain subtle maneuvers, because I think it is time for MBS and Riyadh and America to sometimes show restraint and give signals behind closed doors to Tehran to really not do the wrong thing now. And there's a senatorial, there are US senators in China today. They're going to meet with Xi, or maybe they're meeting now. Chuck Schumer already said he was disappointed that China didn't come out more forcefully in its statement and couldn't simply say, this is terrible what Hamas did, and instead just called for everyone to have restraint. So you see, a lot of important players have to not say too much and do too much right now, and that is difficult if a bunch of Republican extremists, because of their own career moves, are just driving you on social media, on Fox News and on the Steve Bannon podcasts and so forth, and forcing you into rash things. This week is not when that should be happening.
The irony is the House of Representatives doesn't have a speaker because of dysfunction within the House. So the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress right now can't actually play a constructive role in this. And then secondarily, you do have Republicans condemning Hamas for attacks on civilians and other innocents, while simultaneously saying we shouldn't back Ukraine against a Russian invasion that's doing exactly the same thing. So it's one of those moments that gives you pause about both rationality and process and the things that good civic government should be doing in a time of crisis. Javier, how do oil majors position themselves when an event like this occurs? Do they? I'm assuming that they play sort of a backdoor role in providing whatever their own intelligence is and looking after their own needs with the U.S. diplomatic corps and the diplomatic corps overseas, or is that a kind of a simplistic highlights for children view of it on my part?
I think that in some ways that's the view that we will have on a 1973 kind of a style crisis, where American oil companies were still running the Saudi oil industry. There were big presence in Iraq, in Iran, etc., etc. I think that at the moment, most of the oil majors are simply spectators, as we are on the crisis. They are looking from the sidelines. There is some gas production nearby offshore Israel, and one gas platform operated by Chevron, the American oil company, has been ordered to shut down as a precaution. I suppose that the main risk there is that one of the Hamas rockets just hits the platform, and obviously something that the Israeli authorities don't want to see. But other than that, the oil majors are going to be just watching from the sidelines. If the crisis was to reach a point where we think that potentially oil supplies are affected, which at the moment we are far away from that scenario, I think that everyone in the oil industry will start building inventories as a precaution, but we are very far away from that.
Lay out your argument for why you think oil prices aren't going to be affected by this in terms of, the strategic petroleum reserve and other factors
Well,
like that.
we have first of all a big difference from 1973 is that the United States and his allies, and that also includes countries outside the alliance like China, they have significant strategic petroleum reserves that they can be used in case of a big disruption. Yes, for sure, the SPR in America is not as large as it was 2 years ago because Biden tapped the reserve during the crisis with the invasion of Ukraine, but it's still a significant amount of oil. And then Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are not siding with Hamas, and they are also sitting on significant amount of spare capacity that they can put into the market. So prices went up today around 3-4%, but let's remember that they went down 10% last week. The increase in prices has not been much. I think that the biggest risk from an economic point of view emanating from the oil market is that prices stay close to $100, perhaps a bit higher, perhaps a bit lower, but for much longer than we were expecting. And that slowly filters into inflation and convinces the Fed to keep also interest rates higher, and that can really have a big economic impact. But I mean, as Andreas was saying, we don't know how this is going to play out. And I think that talking to oil traders with oil executives this morning, what the focus at the moment of the oil industry, when they are looking at this from a geopolitical point of view, is not much about what is happening right now, but how this is going to play out in the days and weeks ahead. And one key that I keep getting from people with a lot of experience in government that now work for oil companies is the hostages. That changed completely the situation because Hamas and Jihad Islamic may have anywhere from 100 to 200 Israeli under hostages. And let's remember that many of them may be also dual nationals. It may not be just an Israeli hostage situation. It could be a bunch of Americans, a bunch of French, a bunch of British, dual nationals, which complicates a lot of the situation. A lot of Western governments are going to want to have a say on what happens.
And children among them, it's believed.
Indeed.
As well, which makes it even more dire and heart-wrenching when people start to look at this in terms of a military response and where the room for diplomacy is when something like that's in the mix. Again, Hamas had to know that kind of an action was going to provoke a very intense response. So I think the intensity of that response is the tipping point in all this. While the beauty of talking to both of you is you're both equally facile, moving between geopolitics and economics and finance. I want to stay with you for one sec, Javi, since we're on the Saudis' oil and the Saudis' role in this. The Saudis are a wild card in all of this. Their movement closer to Israel, it was believed to be one of the incenting factors for Hamas's attack. MBS has been a multifaceted character on the international stage, obviously vilified by some because of the Jamal Khashoggi murder and his own thuggishness in certain ways. He's been trying to refashion himself now as a more normative steward. That's yet to be seen. What does this moment present for MBS and the Saudis?
I think that it's very similar to the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It presents another opportunity for MBS to reshape himself and play his cards very carefully, probably regaining influence and rehabilitating his image. MBS. We remember where we were about a year and a half ago before Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. MBS was on his way down. He was keeping his head down. Khashoggi has happened. He was not welcome, and no one in the West was traveling to Saudi Arabia. And all of a sudden, oil prices went above $100. Saudi Arabia became an international player again in the oil market, and that really rehabilitated in some ways Mohammed bin Salman, or at least Western governments have to go to Saudi Arabia and engage, even if they found what he did with Jamal Khashoggi was, morally reprehensible. Grotesque is a better word indeed. And I think that this again presents another opportunity. The oil price is high. The Saudis are sitting on a significant amount of spare capacity. If the Biden administration was to enforce again sanctions against Iran and force Iranian production down, we are going to need Saudi oil to offset that. So it really presents another opportunity for Mohammed bin Salman to play in the G20 arena at a high level with everyone respecting his point of view. That's how I think that for the Saudis, this is another opportunity for them. But if you allow me, aside of when we are thinking about actors that can benefit from the current situation, this could also benefit Vladimir Putin in some ways. It's distracting the international community. It's keeping the oil price a bit higher than expected. And any reduction in Iranian oil price is just a fantastic news for Vladimir Putin, because it was competing against Iran on that kind of black market. The more barrels on the black market, the more discounts Russia needed to offer to his clients, China and India in particular. So great upside for Mohammed bin Salman.
The Putin war machine is funded by oil reserves and oil sales.
Indeed.
Yeah. Andreas, let's talk for a moment about Turkey and Egypt. There's an argument out there that Erdogan could act as something of a broker or doing outreach to Hamas, and Sisi could be a broker or do outreach to Netanyahu and Israel if there was some possibility of a negotiated end to all this. But that all seems very premature to me. It seems like we're a long way off of other players in the region like Turkey and Egypt playing a role as a broker to avert a more heated military confrontation. But tell me your thoughts.
You mentioned two key powers. So Turkey, with Erdogan, who fancies himself a neo-Ottoman figure and has already been trying to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia, or at least a grain deal, and Egypt, the other big Arab power. So that is the hope, that figures like this, with questionable records, these three, including MBS, see the danger of the moment, but the opportunity of the moment, and open themselves to American leadership, if I may put it that, to come to some to a way of keeping this from escalating further. Because that is, I'm very worried at this moment. I just want to throw out World War I, and if you think of a dispute between the Habsburgs and a Serbian nationalist somehow led to every major power in Europe going to war. So we have many conflicts in this region.
Because everyone chose sides.
And everyone hates everyone in some way. And for instance, I think that is part of why the US very recently, in recent weeks, did not make a bigger deal about a miniature genocide happening in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, in which Turkey and Russia and Iran all have stakes as well. So I think people are already saying, well, we can't do everything at once. In this case, there is, unfortunately, and you already got to it through the channel of US politics, there is a risk that the Ukraine-Russia conflict gets linked to this conflict, even though they shouldn't have anything to do with it, each other, except that a lot of the players are the same, including China. So, for instance, Iran has been giving its drones to Russia. Russia would like to show support in return. If Iran now kindle this fire and we strike at Iran, then we are lining up. And which side will China play? And I think that's what Chuck Schumer and the other senators are talking to them about right now. And so you have different conflicts, and we've learned from history that even if the conflicts shouldn't have anything to do with each other, they sometimes get linked. And this is why I think, even though there's a lot of talk about, U.S. hegemony slipping, the unipolar moment is gone. In the 1990s, it would have, of course, been the U.S. that has a role now. But I think the U.S. should now work with all these very questionable characters, Erdogan, MBS, and Sisi, and the others, to say, look, this could get worse. Let's make sure it doesn't. And let's do the Israelis what they must while reminding them at the appropriate time that proportion, not restraint, but proportion is still important.
How optimistic are you that it's going to follow that rational of a path?
I'm not optimistic. I'm a paranoid optimist. If you're advising policymakers, they have to assume, they have to give optimism a chance. Otherwise, it's too dire. But unfortunately, there are so many. Is Hamas irrational? Are the mullahs in Tehran irrational? I don't know. But they are cynical in the sense they want this to go up in flames. And that is the problem. If you think World War I again, the Serbian nationalists didn't care that World War I was about to start when he shot the Archduke of the Habsburgs. So there are a lot of people who would like this to get worse. And this reminds us that this was started by Hamas, and they're using their own population as human shields. And when you're up against people like that, you cannot say on a live spaces like this, I'm optimistic. This is so dangerous. It should be a reminder for all these people to lead, and for the Middle Eastern leaders, I think, to follow the U.S. leadership. And I think it should be a reminder for some of these House Republicans here to shut up and lie low for a moment, and to keep this from becoming a major conflagration, and just to gird ourselves for these awful pictures that will now come our way from Gaza.
To the point that Andreas was making, and speaking this morning with a lot of Middle East oil experts, I was mentioning earlier the hostage as a big wild card in the next few days, but we should not forget that the other wild card is going to be how Israel plays his offensive in Gaza. And Gaza, it's in so many ways a bit of a horrible place. About 45, 50 kilometers long, about 15, 20 kilometers wide, and 2 million people inside. And many Israelis, prime ministers and ministers of defense have come to the question of the military and the ground invasion of Gaza, and everyone has refrained because the cost is very high, and Hamas will use their own population as a shield. I think that one of the key questions for the next week, 10 days, is going to be how the retaliation of Israel and his defense of Israel plays out on the international media, and we don't know what the pictures are going to be. So that is going to also shape the reaction in Riyadh, in Tehran, and in Cairo, because while the regimes are getting a lot closer, or are very close these days with Israel. I mean, certainly the case of the United Arab Emirates, and I think that the same can be said about Mohammed bin Salman. The population of those countries is not there.
Andreas, so let's wrap up with sort of a look at Israel itself. Netanyahu has been hawkish, quite obviously, for some time. He has had a very aggressive posture towards both the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians. I think IDF forces were in the Al-Aqsa Mosque very recently, which was seen by the Palestinians as more than simple disrespect. To what extent, one, did Netanyahu's own hawkishness give rise to this? And then two, does he actually have the ability himself and with his advisors around him to prosecute the kind of response Israel needs to undertake right now?
Well, there's a risk of sounding tone deaf right now to go into very recent Israeli history and use it to explain how we got to this moment. The tone deafness, because right now everyone feels rightly that we have to stand on Israel's side and Israel has to rally together. But I would say that I think for Israel, this is the greatest test since 1948, because not only will it now end up deciding finally, I think in the course of this, between a one-state or a two-state solution for this issue, where the one-state solution would mean an apartheid state, and the two, and that goes into what Netanyahu has been up to this year with his far-right coalition, because one reason Hamas attacked, yet another reason why they may have attacked now, is because they realized Israel was distracted by its almost civil war over the rule of law, which Netanyahu and his coalition wanted to undermine, and the domestic debate whether they're going to be an autocracy and democracy. And remember, even our Biden administration came out when it started as like representing the democracies against the autocracies. That framing no longer works in this region. I think that's become clear in our conversation. But now, and you had Air Force pilots and reservists saying, "I'm not showing up for service before this event because I'm protesting the Netanyahu's attempt to neuter the Supreme Court." And obviously that is now on hold. But how will Israeli society come out of this as essentially an authoritarian war state? That has happened in history, or as still a robust, maybe even a more robust democracy than ever. So I don't know. And I think my hope would be that, well, I don't regard Netanyahu as a responsible actor. In that sense, he's like a lot of others in the region. But the best thing that could happen there is that he bans this coalition and has some sort of unity coalition with others, and that they unite in that way to defeat this enemy, Hamas, and then lay off the Supreme Court after and say we're still going to be a democracy, and that the two-state solution somehow survives this.
Andreas Kluth, Javier Blas, Bloomberg Opinion columnist. I'm sure we're going to return to this topic soon. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and we're grateful to everyone who listened in.